Okay, so you're diving into digital photography for digital media one.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a fun unit.
It is.
And
It is.
there's so much to learn.
Yeah, we've got a stack of sources here.
Oh, wow.
Articles, tutorials, even some equipment reviews,
Cool.
all geared towards helping you nail this unit.
I love that.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting to me is this isn't just about taking pretty pictures.
Right.
It's about like understanding how a camera works,
Yeah,
how to compose a shot,
totally.
and how to use light creatively.
Yes.
These are skills that you can apply to like all sorts of projects, even beyond this class.
Like that video project everyone's talking about?
Oh, yeah.
I bet some of these tips will come in handy for that.
For sure.
But first things first,
Yeah.
let's talk cameras.
Okay.
I remember when I took this class, everyone was stressing about what kind of camera to get.
Oh, for sure.
Did your sources mention that at all?
Absolutely. It's like one of the first things they address. There are so many options out there,
I know.
from simple point and shoots to those fancy DSLRs.
Yeah, the ones you see the pros using.
Exact.
And of course, you can't forget about phone cameras.
Oh, totally.
Those have gotten seriously good lately, haven't they?
They really have.
Yeah.
In fact, some of the sources argue that for like basic photography, a high-end phone camera can actually be a pretty solid choice, especially for students.
Now that you mention it, a lot of my classmates were using their phones for some of the assignments.
Yeah.
But the teacher kept saying something about image quality and sensor size.
Right.
Is that a big deal?
It can be depending on the project.
Okay.
You see, different cameras have different sensor sizes.
Okay.
A larger sensor generally means better image quality, especially in low light.
Okay.
That's why DSLRs are still kind of the gold standard for professional photography.
Okay, so bigger sensor,
Yeah,
better quality.
generally.
Got it.
Yeah.
But DSLRs are pretty expensive, right?
They can be.
Yeah. Is it worth shelling out all that cash if you're just starting out?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It really depends on like your budget and how serious you are about photography. Some of the sources suggest checking if your school has DSLRs you can rent or borrow
Oh, interesting.
before investing in one.
That's a smart idea.
Yeah.
Saves you some money and lets you try out a DSLR before committing.
Exactly.
But honestly, all the buttons and settings on those things can be pretty
I
intimidating.
know, right?
Yeah,
It's a lot.
it is.
But don't worry, once you understand the basics,
Okay.
it's not as overwhelming as it seems.
Okay, so let's talk basics.
Okay.
The sources keep mentioning things like shutter speed,
Right.
aperture, and ISO.
Yep.
I vaguely remember those from my class,
Uh-huh.
but honestly, I was totally lost.
I hear you. It can feel like a whole new language.
It does.
But think of it like this.
Okay.
These three elements control how much light hits your camera's sensor,
Okay.
which ultimately determines how your photo looks.
Okay, so it's all about light.
It is all about light.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do those three things work together? Like, what does shutter speed actually do?
So shutter speed controls how long the sensor is exposed to light.
Okay.
Think of it like blinking.
Okay.
A fast shutter speed is like a quick blink. It freezes action.
Okay.
So you get a sharp shot even if something is moving fast.
So if I were taking pictures at the school's basketball game,
Yes.
a fast shutter speed would help me capture those slam dunks without everything being blurry.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, a slower shutter speed is like a long blink.
Okay.
It lets in more light, which is helpful in dim situations,
Right.
but can also blur moving objects.
So if I wanted to take a moody, artistic photo of the school hallways after everyone's gone,
Yeah.
I could use a slower shutter speed to capture that dim lighting.
That's a great idea.
Okay, awesome.
You're already starting to think like a photographer.
I like it.
Now let's move on to aperture.
Okay, aperture. That one always tripped me up. Is it like the size of the lens opening or
Yeah,
something?
got it. Aperture controls how wide the lens opens to let in light.
Okay,
It's like the pupil in your eye.
right.
A wider aperture means more light,
Okay.
which is good for low light situations.
Yeah.
But it also affects something called depth of field.
Depth of field.
Yeah.
Wait, is that what makes the background blurry in those cool portraits?
Yes.
Okay.
A wide aperture creates a shallow depth of field,
Okay.
meaning only a small portion of the image is in focus.
Right.
So you can get that blurred background effect, making your subject really pop.
So if I wanted to take a portrait of my friend for the yearbook,
Yeah.
I'd use a wide aperture to blur the busy background and make them stand out.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Now, a narrow aperture keeps more of the scene in focus,
Okay.
which is great for landscapes where you want everything from the mountains in the back to the flowers in the front to be crisp and clear.
All right. So wide aperture for that cool, blurry background.
Yes.
Narrow aperture for keeping everything in focus.
Good at it.
Makes sense.
Awesome.
But what about ISO?
ISO.
That one always sounded super technical.
Think of ISO as your camera's sensitivity to light. A low ISO setting means the sensor isn't very sensitive, so you need more light for a good exposure.
So like if I'm shooting outside on a bright sunny day, I'd use a low ISO.
Exactly.
Duh.
But in low light, you need to crank up the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive.
So that's why my photos from the school dance were all grainy.
Yeah.
I probably had the ISO way too high.
It's a common mistake.
Yeah.
High ISO can lead to noise or grain in your images,
Right.
especially if you're using a camera with a smaller sensor.
Okay, so it's a trade-off.
It is.
Low ISO for crisp photos in bright light.
Yes.
High ISO for darker situations, but with the risk of some graininess.
You got it.
Got it.
Yeah.
This is a lot to remember.
It is a lot.
But you mentioned that most cameras have automatic settings, right?
They do. And for a lot of everyday shooting, those automatic settings will do a decent job.
Okay.
But as you get more comfortable with these concepts,
Yeah.
you'll want to start experimenting with manual controls.
Right, because understanding these settings gives you more control over the final look of your photos.
Exactly.
So it's like learning the rules before you can break them.
I like that.
But speaking of rules,
Yeah.
what about composition?
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that a big part of photography too?
Composition is huge.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay.
It's super important. It's all about how you arrange the elements in your photo to create a visually appealing and engaging image.
So it's not just about pointing your camera at something and clicking.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of thought that goes into it.
A lot of thought.
Wow.
Absolutely. Think about it like this. You're telling a visual story
Okay.
with your photos,
Mhm.
and composition helps you guide the viewer's eye and
Right.
create the mood or feeling you want to convey.
Interesting. The sources mention the rule of thirds a lot.
Yes.
I remember my teacher talking about that.
Yeah.
Something about dividing the frame into a grid.
Exactly. Imagine drawing 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines across your image,
Okay.
creating 9 equal sections.
Mm.
The rule of thirds suggests placing your subject
Oh,
or
right.
points of interest
Right.
along those lines or at the intersections
Okay.
rather than right in the center.
So it's about creating balance and visual interest.
Yes.
Instead of just having your subject smack dab in the middle.
Right. It often leads to a more dynamic and engaging composition.
Okay.
But any rule,
Yeah.
you can break it.
Okay.
Sometimes centering your subject
Yeah.
can create a powerful effect,
Right.
especially if you have strong symmetry in your scene.
So it's more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule.
Exactly. It's a good starting point.
Okay.
But as you get more comfortable with
Yeah.
composition, you'll start to develop your own sense of what works and what doesn't.
Right.
There are other techniques you can play with too.
Okay, the sources mentioned something about leading lines.
Yes.
What are those?
Leading lines are elements in your scene
Oh,
that naturally draw the viewer's eye toward a certain point.
Okay.
Think about a winding road leading to a distant mountain
Hmm.
or a row of trees framing your subject.
Okay.
They create a sense of depth and they guide the viewer through the image.
So it's like creating a visual path
Yes,
for the viewer to follow.
exactly.
I like that.
And then there's foreground interest.
Foreground interest.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's basically including something in the foreground of your photo
Okay.
to create a sense of depth and scale.
Yeah.
Let's say you're taking a picture of your school building.
Yeah.
Instead of just shooting the building straight on,
Right.
try finding something to put in the foreground, like a tree branch
Hmm.
or a bench or even a person.
So instead of a flat two-dimensional image,
Yes.
you're giving it a more three-dimensional feel.
Yeah, exactly. And it also adds a sense of context and place to your photo.
Wow, I never realized how much thought goes into composition.
It's a lot.
It's almost like creating a piece of art
It is.
rather than just taking a snapshot.
I love that. And speaking of art, let's talk about lighting.
Ah, lighting, that's a big one.
It is.
I mean, you can't always control where the sun is, right?
We can.
Especially if you're shooting outside for a class assignment.
True, but you can definitely work with natural light to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of the golden hour?
Golden hour. Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Is this something to do with sunsets?
It is. It's the hour after sunrise
Okay.
and the hour before sunset.
Mm.
The light is really soft and warm during those times,
Okay.
creating long shadows
Yeah.
and a beautiful glow.
Right.
Photographers love it.
Okay, now I remember the teacher mentioned it
Uh-huh.
when we were talking about shooting outdoor portraits.
Yes.
But what if you can't shoot during the golden hour?
Right.
Like, what if your digital media class is in the middle of the day?
Well, midday light can be pretty harsh,
Yeah, it can.
especially in the summer,
Right.
but there are ways to work with it.
Okay.
You can find some open shade, like
Uh-huh.
under a tree or a building overhang.
Right, that would soften the light
It would.
and avoid those harsh shadows.
Exactly.
Okay.
You can also use a reflector to bounce light back onto your subject.
Wait, a reflector.
Yeah,
Like those big silver things you see photographers using?
exactly. They're actually pretty affordable.
Oh, okay.
And you can even make your own
Oh, wow.
with some cardboard and aluminum foil.
Cool.
Yeah.
So even if you're stuck shooting in the middle of the day, there are ways to manipulate the light to your advantage.
There are.
What about indoor photography?
Indoor
Do
photography.
we have any tips for that?
Indoor lighting can be a bit trickier
Okay.
because you often have less natural light to work with,
Yeah.
but you can definitely get creative.
Okay, so what do you do when you're stuck shooting inside?
Hmm.
Is it all about using the flash?
The flash can be helpful sometimes,
Right.
but it can also create some harsh shadows
Yeah.
and make your photos look a bit artificial.
Right.
Try experimenting with the available light first.
Okay, so like using lamps,
Yeah.
overhead lights, or even light coming from a window.
Exactly. You might be surprised at how much you can achieve with a little creativity.
Mm.
You can also adjust your camera settings
Uh-huh.
to compensate for the lower light levels.
Right, like bumping up the ISO.
Exactly.
But we talked about how that can lead to grainy photos.
It can,
Right.
but sometimes it's a necessary trade-off.
Yeah.
You can also use a tripod to keep your camera steady
Mm.
when shooting in low light,
Right.
which allows you to use a slower shutter speed
Okay.
without getting blurry photos.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah,
A tripod would definitely come in handy for those low-light situations.
for sure.
And speaking of handy tools,
Yes.
the sources also talk about how digital photography can be used for more than just taking pretty pictures.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember the teacher mentioning something about that.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't all about artistic stuff. There were some
Yeah.
practical uses for photography too, right?
Absolutely. You can use your camera to scan documents.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So I don't need a separate scanner for all my schoolwork?
Nope. Just make sure you have good lighting.
Okay.
And hold the camera steady.
Got it.
You can also use your camera to take notes,
Interesting.
especially if you're a visual learner.
Mm.
Snap a picture of a whiteboard or a diagram
Right.
instead of trying to scribble everything down.
That's a great idea, especially for those classes where the teacher writes a ton on the board.
Exactly.
And think about using your camera to remember things.
Yes.
Like where you parked your car
Yeah.
or a cool store display you want to
Yeah.
check out later.
Exactly.
It's like having a visual notepad.
Yes.
And don't forget about the power of photographic evidence.
Oh.
Evidence?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Let's say you get a scratch on your bike
Okay.
or your locker gets damaged.
Right.
Take a picture of it.
Hmm.
It can be helpful to have like photographic proof if something happens.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
A picture really can be worth 1,000 words.
it can.
So, as you can see, digital photography goes beyond just taking pretty pictures.
Way beyond.
That's a versatile tool
Yes.
that you could use in all sorts of ways,
Yes.
both creative and practical.
Absolutely.
This is all super helpful.
Good.
I'm already feeling more confident about tackling the photography unit in my digital media class.
Awesome.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious, what's the most important thing for beginners to remember when they're just starting out with photography? I know when I first started out, I was so worried about like getting everything technically perfect,
Yeah.
all those settings and rules.
It's a lot.
It can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's easy to get bogged down in the technical stuff. But I think the most important thing is to just like have fun and experiment.
So don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. That's how you learn.
Right.
Digital photography is great because you can take tons of pictures without worrying about wasting film.
Right. Yeah.
So try different things, see what works, and develop your own style.
The sources actually talk a lot about finding your own style.
Uh-huh.
What does that even mean?
It's about like figuring out what kind of photos you enjoy taking,
Right.
what subjects you're drawn to,
Mm.
and how you want to express yourself visually.
Yeah.
Do you like capturing candid moments,
Mm.
or are you more interested in carefully composed shots?
Mm.
Do you prefer black and white or color? There's no right or wrong answer.
So it's less about following rules
Right.
and more about using the camera as a tool to tell your own stories.
Exactly. Think about the photographers you admire.
Okay.
What makes their work stand out?
Yeah.
It's often their unique perspective and their ability to capture a feeling or an emotion in their photos.
So how do you develop that eye for photography?
It takes practice.
Right.
Pay attention to the world around you.
Okay.
Look for interesting compositions, light and shadow, and moments that capture your attention. And don't just look through the lens of your camera.
No.
Look at art.
Yeah.
Watch movies.
Right.
Pay attention to the way light falls on objects in everyday life.
So it's like training your brain to see the world differently.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the better you'll become at recognizing those special moments and translating them into compelling photographs.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not just about technical skill.
No.
It's about developing your creative vision.
Yes.
And the cool thing is that everyone's vision is different.
Absolutely. That's what makes photography so exciting.
Right.
There are endless possibilities for creative expression.
Wow, this has been such an insightful deep dive
It has.
into the world of digital photography.
I agree.
I feel like I learned so much,
Me too.
not just about cameras and settings,
Right.
but about how to approach photography in a more creative and meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's key.
It is.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up,
Okay.
what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
Don't be afraid to experiment and have fun.
Mm,
Photography is a journey of discovery.
I like that.
Embrace the learning process, try new things, and see where your creativity takes you.
That's great advice. So grab your camera, get out there, and start exploring the world through your own unique lens.
I love it.
Who knows, you might just discover a hidden talent or passion.
Absolutely.